This chapter of Poppy and Rye is chapter 13. It's called What Happened to Rye. As Rye had listened to Poppy speak about ragweed, he hardly knew what to think. He was confused. He was upset. He felt humiliated. Ragweed was always getting in his way. He had done so when he was alive, and now he was doing so even after he had died. And yet, Rye knew perfectly well that Ragweed's death was awful. Truly, he felt terrible about it. And yet, from the moment he had begun to dance on the meadow with this graceful mouse, the one named Poppy, he had fallen in love with her. He hoped and thought she felt something of the same for him. But now that he had discovered that she was Ragweed's brother and admitted she loved Ragweed, surely there was no hope for him. And yet, he found himself thinking that perhaps now that Ragweed had died, Poppy might turn to him. And yet, Rye felt deeply ashamed of himself. How self-centered and selfish he was. Such horrible thoughts. How low, how bad. Poppy would never be able to see anything decent in him. But the next moment he thought, I'm not a bad mouse, I'm not. It was with these thoughts that Rye raced from the nest. He didn't go far. He could not outrun his feelings. More importantly, he did not want to go away from this dear mouse, this Poppy. He found himself at the edge of the beaver's pond. It was raining steadily, monotonously. The world looked away. He felt gray and sodden. Moreover, except for him, everything seemed immense. He was nothing but small, bad, useless mouse. Hunkering down, consumed by a sensation that the whole world despised him, Rye shivered with wet and cold. Is there any place in this wide world for such a wretched as I? He asked himself. Simultaneously, he darted a look over his shoulder to see if, just possibly, someone, he dare not say who, had followed him. When he saw that no one had, he was angry he had even checked. A mournful Rye grazed down at the pond. A mist was rising off the water as if it were smoldering. A few beavers were hard at work, and suddenly Rye saw that the pond was much higher than it had been before. Anger swept through him. How he hated the beavers! Yet there they were, making the dam higher. Even as misery rained down on his head, had they no feelings? Would they never stop? As he looked on, Rye began to have an idea. If he could find some way to put an end to what the beavers were doing, might he find a way to redeem himself? Surely if he kept from the building the dam higher, or better yet, forced them to move away, he would become a hero to his family. He had alone defeated them. Why, even Poppy might see him differently from Ragweed then. Rye surveyed the pond. The beaver's main lodge was not far from the dam. He remembered his father telling him that the way that the beavers got into the lodge was by swimming through an underwater passage. If he could get into the lodge, he might. Actually, Rye was not sure all this might do. He supposed he would need to think of something once he was in the lodge, but the main thing to do was to get there. Surely he could do that. Like all his brothers and sisters, he was a good swimmer. Rye raced down to the edge of the pond. The beaver's dam was built where the brook had a narrow V in the land. The dam, made of twigs, branches, and logs plastered over with mud, was some 20 feet across and 3 feet wide. By going out along the dam, he would be much closer to the lodge. But when Rye reached one of the ends of the dam, a beaver was working on it. He had brought up a heap of mud and dumped it, and was now using his tail to smooth it down. Though impatient, Rye bided his time. One whack of the beaver's tail, and not to mention what he could do with his teeth, and Rye would be crushed. The beaver on the dam gave some final pats of mud, surveyed his work, uttered a few grunts, and then moved ponderously towards the edge of the dam, and then dove under the water and swam away. Rye crawled out upon the dam. He was impeded by the twigs and branches that were crisscrossed and bent in all directions. By the time he got near the lodge, it was caked with mud and bits of leaves. Not caring how he looked, Rye crept down close to as water as possible. Then he hesitated. There was an image of Poppy that rose into his mind. If he could succeed, he'd be a hero. Holding his nose with one paw, Rye jumped into the water, tail first. He landed with a splat, momentarily floundered, and then righted himself. Shaking his eyes and whiskers free of water, he began to swim towards the lodge. 3 feet from the lodge, he paused and began to tread water. He had reached the most difficult part, the entrance. Suddenly he realized he had no notion of where, other than underwater, the entry hole might be. It could be on the other side, opposite of where he was. He would have to try his luck. Filling his lungs with air, he let himself drop down and began to swim underwater. It had been gray on the water's surface. It was much darker below. Before him, the lodge loomed like a shadowy lump. It was upon the bottom of the pond where it rose up, a huge dome, enormous and impenetrable. Stroking steadily, Rye pushed on, a tail of tiny bubbles escaping from its clenched mouth. Gradually, he began to make out what appeared to be a dark hole. Was that the entryway? Lungs close to bursting, Rye had to make a final decision. If he guessed wrong, he would drown. At least I tried, he told himself. Farewell, Poppy, he murmured. Farewell, love. Farewell, world. Kicking hard, paws maddeningly stroking the water, he propelled himself into the hole. The moment he did so, everything turned as dark as night without the moon. Rye was no longer trying to get into the lodge. He was struggling to save his life. His strokes were wild, his kicks frenzied. Unable to endure any more, he shot up and found air. Grasping for breath, he waved his paws freely to keep afloat and suddenly moved towards a ledge of slippery mud. Reaching it, he crawled his way up, falling back a few times, finally heaving himself onto the slimy shelf. Eyes shut, he lay there coughing and spitting water. He opened his eyes. He was in the lodge. A few feet away sat an enormous beaver, and the beaver was looking right at him. Well, bless my teeth and smooth my tail, Mr. Knud said with a smile full of orange teeth. Glad you came, pal. A stranger is just a friend you haven't met yet. Hey, and I mean that sincerely.